Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? It's okay. Thank you. Okay. It feels a bit like a homecoming. I haven't been to the lab before. But as telling some people at lunch, I'm one of those grubby Texans who, with his family, would come over to northern New Mexico as a child, and it started my love of backpacking in the Pecos Wilderness, and have been to the city of Los Alamos several times before, and it's great to be here. And I really want to thank my host, Jim Cruz, and Jeanette Gallegos for a lot of the coordination, and all the people who have set aside time to meet with me, and all of you who've put your time here today. I really want to make this useful. It's not a pitch for the book per se. It is a standalone talk, and I'd like everyone, whether you're leaning towards the pure science side or leaning towards the engineering side or the communication side, to have something thought-provoking to take with you out of this. That's the sort of cover of the book, maybe suggestive for some of the fascinating work you do here in the lab. It does remind me, speaking of history of the lab, that I am one of the many, the sort of diaspora of Hans Bethe academic grandchildren. A key person on my thesis lab worked directly under Hans Bethe. So here's our plan for today. We're going to start with craft at some risk, right? That can be, my mother, when she read a rough draft of the book, said, yeah, and she taught English in grade school for some of her career, said, yeah, are people really going to like you getting into sentences? But then the editors of journals who have read this book really love that chapter. So we're going to do just a tiny bit of the craft down to the sentence level. Common modes are super science-specific communication issues we have. Give you two examples in there. Calibration is sort of the juiciest part of the talk. Thinking of ourselves as primates when we communicate and when we take in information, I think is super useful, and actually a little contraindicated with how we're often brought up as scientists and our assumptions in communication. And then, as Mark mentioned, the conveyance, I'll talk a little bit about giving talks. Okay, I have two tent poles in this talk of little personal stories. And later we'll mention maybe why I did that. This is a Rice University campus in Houston, Texas. Yeah, go Owls. Thank you. And when I was there, I had a roommate who was an English major. We're still friends. The English professor now, bless him. But John said, you really like writing and you love reading novels. Why don't you take a fiction writing class with me? And I said, why not? So I wandered over from the physics building over to where they were teaching this writing class, learned a very different way of doing business. Then I would traipse back to the physics building and never really thought about, okay, now it's time for upper division lab. Now I write this way. Now I write with my $10 words and 5-line sentences. And oh, sure, over there when we talk about good fiction, I think about the reader, and I think about where is the reader? Why will the reader read my next sentence? Why will the reader turn a page? But now that stayed over with the English classes. We don't really have to worry about that in physics. And I never questioned that dichotomy all the way through grad school. Although I was hooked, I kept taking writing classes. I took all these MFA level writing classes. And one reason I went to Oregon State is that they didn't mind me taking writing classes as long as I got my physics classwork done and all my lab work there and superconductivity. So let's talk a little bit about craft and things we might take from a fiction writer without all the things you might fear of bringing from fiction. And I like to half joke that the most important thing I've had in grant proposal success is having fiction workshops. And people say, were you just making up stories? And well, no, not any more than any other grant proposal. But let me just talk about some of those things. So my first book was about Max Planck, and I wrote a whole version of Planck's life, biography, in order. Born to a fairly comfortable Prussian family, lived in Kiel, swam in the canal, etc. And my wife, probably my best reader and editor, she's a molecular biologist, Dana, said, this is nice. It's got a lot of great information in it. The writing is actually good, but it's dull, And I looked at that and I said, yeah, if we think of fiction, we need to start somewhere that can hook an audience. And we can't always do that in scientific writing, which is often very prescribed and has lots of rules, but we can think about the audience. So in the second version of the book, I said, well, what will capture a lot of people's interest? How can we show that this life was amazing and kind of spellbinding in parts? So we start closer to this age, when Planck was writing a letter directly to Adolf Hitler, begging for his son's life. His son was in the German resistance and had been arrested by the Gestapo. So we start there. Let's talk about hooks. Journalists will say you have a number of go-to things, and you'll see this once you know about them. You'll see them in local journalism. There's something from my favorite periodical, The Onion. It has locality or infects a lot of people, is related to current events, etc. I don't think those do us a lot of good in science communication, but I think we can find several things. Stakes, and you all know this very well. A lot of your work can affect millions of people, whole societies. It matters to a lot of people. But I do think a lot of times our proposals, our papers, our communications, even if it's on some side part of some project, can submerge the stakes when they might help a reader read forward. And I do want to be clear, in this talk, I'm not just talking about communicating science to the general public, which is very important, but a lot of what my book is about and this talk is about is just communicating between technical peoples, or at least technically sympathetic peoples, right? And we often submerge the stakes of why we're working on some project and why someone should keep reading past the first paragraph or listening past the first slide. Another one that works well, I have friends who do black hole thermodynamics. Some of my biophysics work was on the electric sense of sharks and their relatives. So it's something like there's not big stakes. There aren't even that many people hit by sharks. The opposite is true, honestly. But so there's a mystery. Like, how can these things detect a nanovolt centimeter swimming in a room temperature electrolyte? Or black hole thermodynamics can hold a lot of interest. And scientific readers and audiences love mysteries. Like, how does this work? And you can surface those questions. I even tell people in the book to consider questions in your subheadings. They're very, very compelling to keep people reading and moving forward. I think a lot of science-sympathetic people love a surprise. It could be when I was young, I think we still thought most stars probably wouldn't have planets. Now we have this amazing explosion of seeing extrasolar planets all over the place. So people love a surprise in their story. We can go to that. But the most reliable for scientific communication is what I call goal versus obstacle. One of my best fiction writers is now passed away, Ehud Habazelit, used to say, and he said, don't worry so much about plot. Every plot that's ever been written that's worth anything, from the holy books onward, boils down to you have something, a character, a person, a movement, or I would say even a molecule or a subroutine. Something is trying to get something done, really has a clear goal, but it runs into an obstacle. Or the person, or the team, or the effort, or the center runs into an obstacle. How are they going to overcome that or circumvent it, etc.? And that really supplied in my second book a lot of the narrative tension about all the engineering of the Apollo program. There were just so many open questions and problems that had to be overcome, so many obstacles. We didn't know in the early days how you could seal a window against the vacuum of space. How would the sealant not just boil off and the window pop out, etc.? Don't get me going about the Apollo program. Okay, moving on. Okay, at the sentence level, and this is the part that the risk being dry, but I just have one quick example and a few go-to rules. And let me say right away, what I'm not advocating is going to your 10-page white paper. I'm not suggesting that you have time to then torture yourself over every sentence. But we all know some sentences matter more than others, right? So the abstract, the pitch, the earliest parts of the introduction, some part of the conclusion that you know people are going to flip to. You can spend a lot of time on these sentences. And I think there's a lot of things we get into as technical writers that don't serve us well. And here's part of it. I work with a lot of students, a lot of other scientists. I think there's sort of our instincts when we want to be clear come up against the reality of super clear writing that you would learn in journalism training or people writing effectively in novels and things like that. We think that we need a sentence to get longer. More words will make it clear because I'm clarifying and repeating. Or even, I think, subconsciously we think, well, my sentence by expanding is kind of slowing down and will be easier to understand. But all professional writers will tell you, you try to trim words to make it more clear. There's always useless ballast in our sentences. So we like to say in some of the consulting work I do in Silicon Valley, if you can cut a document by 20%, data kind of shows the readability and the memory, what hits home in the readership pops up, however you want to measure that, even more than 20%. So let's go right to an example. I tried to make it, you have an amazing magnetic field lab I've followed for some time. This isn't quite relevant to that. This is a goofy sentence, but typical of what we do, right? Let's talk about, and I don't use red ink with my students or the people I consult with. I just say there are opportunities. There are opportunities here to make this more engaging and, importantly, more informative and a more simple path for the reader. We want to have sympathy for our readers. So as Focus, we do this a lot. We talk this way. We all write this way. It was. So it is one of these vague pronoun subjects. We use that a lot, this and that. It's kind of unmoored. This is even more unmoored than when I woke up this morning and said, it's chilly outside. At least that refers to some local chunk of atmosphere or some adiabatic packet sitting outside the window or something. Was is a being verb. Is, are, was, were. I like to call these kind of the microwave ovens of verbs. They can help you in many sentences, but they're not arresting. They don't grab attention. They don't specify things for readers, so they're sometimes missed opportunities. We use them a lot because they don't take a lot of thought, but English has virtual plenty of verbs. My multilingual friends really point this out. If you look at French, and you want to look at something, you have like 2 verbs. But in English, you can scrutinize or gape or glare. There's just so many options in English, and we don't always, in our scientific writing, take advantage of verbs. So avoid for key sentences, if you want to engage people, avoid vague subjects when you can and opt for more active, precise verbs that are going to do some lifting for you. Ultimately, a lot of good writing in English is about just finding the right verb, and it does a ton of work for you. Okay, examples of resetting this about our poor magnet, which has been so discouraging. We could elevate the magnet as the clear subject of the sentence. New magnet exhibited a discouraging lack of reliability, but even better, what did the magnet do? It overheated during its first test. No, maybe we have some current density problem. So these sentences get shorter and shorter, and arguably in this example, they could get more informative. And that's an easier path for the reader. All right, that's it. That's the only example sentence I have. If anyone's nerding out on that stuff, I have other examples in the graveyard of this deck that we could look at together after the talk. We have the room for a while. Okay, 3. So subjects, think about your verbs. Let's reduce some clutter. Oh, I have a good example here I found in the literature. You don't have to read this. It's like 7 or 8 prepositional phrases talking about the vortex glass mixed state of high temperature superconductivity. I wrote that in 1997 in Physical Review B with plenty of clutter. That's my soundtrack. No, it's not. Some great instructors of writing say, consider sentences as tight ropes, and you decrease audience yield as you go along. They're going to start, subconsciously wishing they were looking at their phones, etc. Maybe an image like this causes you some anxiety. It does me. Some may be more comfortable with it. But think of sentences as being cluttered, and we have opportunities there. A lot of scientific sentences have a wind-up, and again, this is trying to be We often inhabit a writerly voice that we don't need to inhabit because we just kind of feel like that's what we were supposed to do in school and stuff. In general, when seeking to, and often if you interrogate these phrases, they're not really doing anything for your sentence or your document or to increase reader understanding or convey anything. It's sort of a wind up like a pitcher, right? We could get rid of some of that. There's also a lot of obviousness. I went to give a talk at the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center, a great place in Seattle, if some of you have heard of that. And these biologists doing groundbreaking work, but there's a lot of in perspective patients. And anyone reading that paper would have realized, is this my microphone maybe? Making the hot water sound? Yeah, well, we didn't think you were going to inject random people at a bus stop. We knew this was about, treating a prospective patient. So where can we get rid of? We see a lot of this. We just keep repeating, even though it's clear in the section of your document or the title, what's going on. Prepositional phrases to the nth power. We do a lot of that, and it makes sense. Like we need to say at low magnetic field, at low temperatures. To the left of the cryostat, whatever. We need to specify to make things clear, especially if someone's going to repeat our work. But I give a lot of little tricks in the book of ways if you've got 3 or 4 prepositional phrases in a row, I think it can function like speed bumps, and you're like, rattling the molars of your audience. It gets harder to read. They run out of this internal breath we have when we read, and there are ways around that. Something to look for. We do a lot of verb piles. To allow us to attempt or to try to analyze. And there's a lot of trying and attempting, and we all acknowledge that our work is hard and difficult, but I think we all know we're trying. It's amazing how many sentences, when you see these, I call it the 2-2 rule, we have verb to verb. There's almost always one verb kind of slowing things down and not doing anything for you. And you can just focus on the real verb. You cut these things, the extra words, and it's much more clear and simple, and you haven't lost any intellectual property there. All right, let's wrap up on craft. I have some quotes or some distilled ideas from some wonderful American writers. Toni Morrison likes to say, what you don't write, or we could say what we've edited out, gives what you do write its power. Really love that simple thought. A lot of good writing is editing, and I know it takes time. I'm not saying I love editing, and I'm never happier than when I have a big stack of paper of my own writing I can go after. But even just one edit. There are people, by the way, who edit with purpose. Like, I'm going to look at my verbs on one run through, and then separately I'm going to look through and I'm going to see when my sentences are more than 3 lines long. You could just do 2 quick passes like that. Some of you may know George Saunders. Interestingly, has a geophysics background training, right? Lincoln in the Bardo, all kinds of wonderful short stories. He's become quite a writer and a writing instructor. But he says good writing is really like almost a call and response, a sort of question and answer. And a good writer is thinking about what questions are in the audience's mind, and how do I answer them just enough to lead to the next question and keep them engaged. And almost becomes this sort of this dance and dialogue. I really love that idea. And when I work with people and they're complaining about the difficulty in getting started, this writer's block sort of idea. Sometimes just sitting down and writing yourself a Q&A with a prospective reader. They could be goofy. You could make them sarcastic or skeptical. You could make them dense. I don't know. You could have all kinds of fun or have a person in mind. Write a Q&A, and it'll really get you going. And also center in your writing what questions and concerns the audience has. There's nothing more important. And I know a lot of you have a lot of different audiences, and that can be challenging, but something to hold in mind. One more, and we'll hear from Francine one more time at the end of the talk. I love this. Would you say it that way? A great thing to do with an important segment of some document you're working on is read it aloud. Read it aloud, and the text will call out to you, like, wow, I kind of needed to swallow there, or I couldn't breathe, or that sounded really strange and awkward. Ultimately, I think a lot of good writing sounds like someone talking to you. And when I've had feedback on books that say, it sounds like Brandon's in the room with you, that's the happiest I get. That's kind of a goal. And I like to joke with my students, right? If we talked the way we write science, here's how we would ask one another to lunch. And you know this is kind of true. This probably resonates with some things you've read recently or even written. And my first drafts look a lot like this. Now we're going to move to our next segment where we're done with craft. I think it gets more and more juicy. What is it is suggested, and what is be relocated? This is something we do a lot, specifically in our scientific writing. So I'm going to talk about just two common modes and talk about those. The first one relates to voice. You may have heard of passive voice, and those little examples I had, including the underlined one, like be relocated, and you don't know, well, who's doing the relocating? Where is the actor in this sentence? Often passive voice. I had a laboratory at UCSF working near my wife's lab who agreed to be in these goofy photos in the book, because I think a lot of scientists might not understand passive voice at first glance, but it's sort of the phenomena were investigated. No real scientist here. They're anonymous. Any scientist doing this work would have found the same conclusions, right? And so-called active voice would say, our lab investigated, and then we kind of become human beings, et cetera. And thank you to David Booth's lab. David Booth, who smartly did not appear in these goofy photos in my book, but David's wonderful. Okay, example from my work with the Green Science Policy Institute. I was deputy director for a while. Here's an active one. Our analysis found. Okay, and this is true. Please do not eat in your cars. And if you have kids you're carrying in your car, try to steer away from them eating those Cheerios that fell in the seats. A lot of flame retardants are pretty bad for us, but they are everywhere in automobiles, it turns out. Another talk maybe. Passive would be flame retardants were found in some percentage of automobile foam samples. Now, this isn't always bad. A lot of professional writers and journalists and all my fiction instructors would just kind of hammer us, do not write in this so-called passive voice where you hide the actor. But for science, it really broadcasts objectivity and universality. I got so interested in this so that you don't have to. I kind of did a deep dive into the literature and talked to linguists who study passive voice, et cetera. Let's just look at a few things about passive voice. It takes up more than a third of science sentences, and this varies a little bit field to field, slightly more prevalent in biology, but it's there. And again, it conveys a universality. Cognitively, it distances the reader from the knowledge of or worry about or existence of the writer, right? And so that helps. Like, let's just talk about the data. Let's talk about the process. It doesn't matter who's over here writing it. That's interesting. My point would be, though, if you're writing a press release, if you're writing for the general public, is Linda here? If you're doing like museum writing, right, for a display, you don't want to distance the writer. It disconnects the reader's emotions from the topic, which you definitely don't want to do in a pitch, the first page of a pitch for new funding, talking to people in Washington, let's say. You might want to use active voice where you can. Pro writers really loathe active voice. I was talking to a couple of your great local writers, like Octavio, and you agree. It really has its place. So let's talk about some considered uses of passive voice in our work. Like I said, it doesn't belong in press releases or fundraising, pitches, outreach to the general public. I'd really try to minimize it. Really great, actually, in giving employee feedback or feedback on the draft of a paper and conflict. I'll get into some more examples of this. But if you're lowering the temperature of a dialogue in what could be contentious or someone who doesn't want feedback, then that's a good thing. And if you're submerging yourself, creating a kind of greater distance between the writer and the reader of the feedback, that might be a good thing. I had a recent story where I found a new publication that was very similar to some old shark gel data my lab had published back in the day. And I literally caught myself. I was about to write, I did this back in this year. And I thought, wait a minute. How about similar data were published? Passive voice, doesn't matter who published it. And I had a link to some of our work and then other work that was also, they might want to. And it turned into a great dialogue. So that was instead of, my lab published this and you should cite us, which could automatically provoke a defensive reaction and maybe no reaction at all. All right, common mode number 2 is very familiar to all of us. We hear a lot about jargon and acronyms. Dana, my wife, was just complaining that she was having to review a paper that she claims had a 30-letter acronym from molecular biology. I think it's really not possible, is it? And I think, I reflect on my own days in training, and I've got people in various stages of their career here maybe, which is great. But I remember as a grad student, not consciously, but I was kind of proud when I started saying the vortex glass scaling transition, right? And I could stand up at a meeting and I felt more belonging. And it's like a merit badge once I mastered some of the terminology or the vernacular as we were discussing it at lunch. But it does create a barrier. And surprisingly, it's not just when you're communicating with the general public. It turns out the data shows that scientists, whether they fully realize it or not, don't love reading a lot of technical jargon either. If you track verbal complexity, there's one called SMOG that was invented in the 60s. These things are free on the internet. You can find some textual complexity algorithm. Throw your work into it. Throw your abstract in there, or just first page of a white paper, and it basically tracks the reading level. And as that reading level goes up, it has a downward pressure, very statistically significant on the number of citations and downloads, et cetera. If a scientist cares about that sort of thing, it's worth thinking about. Interesting. So even in your communications here between adjacent groups or whatnot, you're going to get more of your message across if you can interrogate your use of the $15 words. So I just have a few to mention. Consider when we're up against, because we're all up against this, including work I'm still doing, whether it's history or digging into Planck's work or whatever. I like to think about kind of a quota. If I have a 3-page document, can I get away with just my 2 main $10, $15 words, which I will explain? Can I create a nickname? This sounds silly, but what I mean when I'm writing about the electrosensitive organ in sharks and rays, it's the ampullae of Lorenzini. It has a fascinating story of a 17th century physiologist in Italy. But a lot of papers would say the ampullae of Lorenzini several times, and I just say the organ, because after the first paragraph, people know which organ I'm talking about, and it's not an eye or a liver or something. So that's kind of what I mean by nickname. The other thing we might underuse is parentheses. Actually, we have a verb in our language which is parenthesize, and I love to advocate this. I kind of think it's like welcoming the audience over, lifting the hood, like, here's the engine. We could talk about that if you want, but I can close this. You don't need it to kind of take a ride in my communications car and get where we need to go. It's only so important, right? The thing is a skate. It's this little 2-dimensional, really fascinating predator which hunts with electricity. Okay, the other tentpole story. I think we're doing about right on time. And if I'm doing any AV thing that causes that, let me know. I promise it's not a device in my abdomen near this microphone. This was at the University of British Columbia, and I had just started moving from superconductivity into neuroscience. Was very excited. And I'd already had some lessons. Like the first talks I saw there, I'd never seen anything like it. Like lab members with color photos of smiling faces were on the first slides. And I thought, as a physicist, at the time, I kind of had the names of people in my lab with the grant numbers on the last slide. Like, we're not a sentimental people, I guess. So in addition to lessons like that, there was a kerfuffle going on. I'd had paper on these gels collected from electrosensitive organs, published in a high-profile journal, and some neuroscientists really didn't like it. And they came after the technique, kind of ported from physical chemistry over to this neuroscience problem. And they had submitted a letter confronting the data and claiming they should probably be withdrawn. It was all upheld. It all ended well, which isn't that neither here nor there. But they hadn't ever contacted me. I called them the super friends of neuroscience. There were some kind of big names. And I saw one of them at this conference, with some colleagues or whatever. They're out on the grass between sessions and eating one of those sort of really dry conference sandwiches. And I go up and I say, hey, so-and-so, I'm Brandon Brown. I appreciate your interest in my work. Can we talk about this a little bit? And the gentleman, kind of waved that sandwich. And he said, held up his hand. It's like, no offense, but I don't have anything to say. I actually haven't read your work. I just trust so-and-so, the lead neuroscientist. Now, some of you would find that not surprising. At the time, I was taken aback. I like to tell my students, this isn't how science happens, and we got to be better than that. And I wasn't in a particularly vulnerable place. I think some people get a lot worse of this than I did. I was grant funded and tenured, and anyway. So I was really kind of offended. But then even in this book, which Mark was just talking about, led to this talk, when it was out for review, I get an email from a theoretical physicist buddy, and he says, oh, hey, they got your new manuscript. What do you want me to say, right? So it cuts both ways, and well, why don't you just read it and tell them what you actually think? That would be really helpful. So let's calibrate it, and I want to talk to you. Some of you have heard of this, maybe some people haven't. The social brain hypothesis. I kind of love holding this in mind. I think it's useful in addition to fun. For my third book, Once Upon a Time, I wanted to write a book called Brain versus Physics. And I still might. But I had been at the Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics, and I was kind of this embedded writer watching string theorists have meetings and quantum gravity people. And it's kind of like, why do we think our evolved brain can unify the forces, for example? But how did our evolved brain do things like come up with quarks and quark confinement and QCD, et cetera? And there's not a lot of physicists, anyway, who think about this. I think we just assume it's kind of a limitless thing. The brain can just keep figuring things out. A wonderful theoretical physicist and Nobel Prize winner, Gerard 't Hooft, did write about it in, what was it? In Search of the Fundamental Building Blocks. Yeah, like 1997. Wonderful book, more for the general reader. But he did address this. And this is just a short excerpt, but it's this, I think we hold a lot of us, including myself, kind of hold this in mind tacitly in an unspoken way, that we have big brains, and because they needed to do logic, they needed to have sharper weapons points, we needed smoother, better designed mortars and pestles, and this helped us survive. And I like to call this the Natural History Museum picture of brain evolution, right? There's some diorama, and this is how we evolved relatively big brains and got to where we are in the whole food chain, et cetera. And this is actually called by people who study brain evolution the ecological model, responding to ecological pressures, et cetera. And it turns out, as mammals, we're not much better at procuring food than other mammals in terms of efficiency and the energy we expend on it, et cetera. And we spend an inordinate amount of time hanging out with other primates, like picking insects off of each other, or arguing, throwing things at each other, whatever. So there is an alternative model of brain evolution, which I find compelling, or there's something to keep in mind, so to speak. Do we have these for schmoozing? I got to visit the Duke Lemur Center, and I've corresponded with a noted scholar in this area named Robin Dunbar out of the UK, who's been a big proponent of the so-called social brain hypothesis. And here is my only plot. We kind of lost the animation of it. I'll talk about animating plots later, maybe. if I plot the average group size of primates on this vertical axis and horizontal axis have the size of the neocortex. And don't worry, the neocortex is basically a lot of perception, processing, and reasoning, as I understand it. And Dunbar would be mad at me for putting apes and monkeys on one plot. But just to give you a general idea, and those of you who have physics persuasion in the audience are probably saying, yeah, log-log plot, power law relation. But there's a statistical significance that we may have evolved the brain processing we have just to keep the band together. The complexity of social relations as our primate bands grew to help us survive, that became really complicated. There's a related gossip theory of language that we developed spoken language because it's more efficient than picking insects off of each other and grooming one by one, which is how a lot of primates do the social bonding. If we can talk, we could tell jokes or gossip about people or talk about some other member and talk badly of them in little groups of 5 or 6 or whatever, or send emails with BCCs, whatever, right? And if you look at this plot, this became sort of the famous for some people Dunbar number or the monkey sphere, that we kind of gravitate to about 150 people we can like and have some trust for and some decent knowledge of. Now, I think that's kind of overblown, just the 150. Dunbar has these kind of circles of social acquaintance. There is ample evidence like that the brain as wired doesn't do well with over like 1,500 names, faces, etc. What's interesting, though, and relevant for our communications, I would say, if you believe in the social brain hypothesis, when we offer someone a piece of communication, they say, well, where does the communicator fit? You know, like we're offering people, like I like to say, like a piece of fruit for old primate to primate, and the primate receiving the piece of fruit is like, well, what group of humans do you come from? Do you understand what kind of fruit I like? Did I ask for that fruit? And just a little side note on politics, I think this model is really helpful. And like, how can this other segment of people believe this thing or think this? And it's like, well, what do their closest friends and trusted acquaintances think and believe? And you will turn backflips to make the data fit that, to fit in your little orange realm, I would argue. All right, communications takeaways from the social brain hypothesis for us. Focus on audience, always, right? Sitting down to craft a talk or a piece of writing, what are the expectations, questions, skepticisms of that audience, et cetera? More important than ever if you embrace the social brain. I think in physics in particular, especially when I was coming up, just like, well, here's my data, take it or leave it, and you should like it because it's important and I did a good job on the experiment. So it's a little different than that, a little different than assuming logic rules every day. Now, primate to primate, and maybe disappointing for a lot of scientific thinking and points of view, really, like I said, elevates the messenger identity, like this guy with the sandwich at the conference. I just trust this other person. They're in my network. You're from some crazy superconductivity network. And indeed, I go through the book. I had messed up a lot when I got into neuroscience, not mastering their questions, not saying, well, who is this audience? They don't care as much as I do about like how this organ can do this thing. They care about exactly what it does. Anyway, and it elevates allegiances. I have a bonus for you, though, that I think is useful, talking about pronouns and giving feedback. We see a ton of feedback in group projects and scientific papers, a lot of second person. You did this, or your paper, your analysis, and I think this. I really feel like the primate brain can go to a defensive posture, like you're threatening my position in the group, or if this is in a group setting, the other primates are like, ooh, like which primate am I going to side with? And we can do a lot of good with the so-called inclusive we pronoun, like we all have to get this done, this document's going to sing if we can do this, or focus on the artifact, the analysis is what we're talking about, not you or me, it's the analysis. And notice I said could be refined as a little nod to passive voice, might be really useful in feedback. So as a lot of my friends who are parents like to say, focus on the behavior, or in this case, the artifact, and not the person. So that really resonates with social brain thinking. No, I think I'm fine. We started at maybe after introductions, about 15 after, so I go a little more. I get a little to say on presentations, the conveyance, the fourth C here. I interviewed a data storyteller. I'm very impressed by R.J. Andrews. I can recommend that book to you, Info We Trust, very readable and interesting. I asked R.J., when you see academics give talks, where do you think they go wrong? And I really like this idea of distinguishing a performative slide presentation, visuals to help you, the speaker, convey your message. You know, it's not about the deck and turning and worshiping the deck, which is a real easy tendency. We put a lot of work into our slides, and then, well, I'm done with the talk. I've got the slide deck. And RJ would say, really think about the performance a little bit, a live audience, and a lot of slides he sees with like 4 graphs, joking with some of the communications buddies at lunch, right? And you see these slides with 4 or 5 graphs in them and tons of text. And that is really a record of knowledge. And after RJ said this, I went back to my old slides and say, oh yeah, here I just cut and paste a table out of one of my publications and put it with 3 columns, 4 columns in a slide. And I'm like, that's a record of knowledge, and it has a different purpose, which will get in the way of good talk. So I like to tell my students, you imagine if you're giving a talk that you're writing with chalk in a way, and your other hand is kind of erasing it as you go. So you really, really have to elevate simplicity. Try to actually say a little bit less. And imagine your audience at a great distance. I had this good advice once. Like, think about your audience kind of in the back row. You're falling asleep. They might be maybe not here looking at your phone, but often like just checking their phone for stuff. And can your big subtitles on their own kind of tell some of the story, right? Imagine these things at a great distance. I mentioned in the book a great podcast called 99% Invisible. Some of you have heard this about design. And they have a great episode on flag design. And I like a lot of the rules of what makes a good flag is its simplicity, and you can see it at a distance. And you can think about that for some slides. Avoid what I call a visual playpen. You have very smart people in your audiences. Like if you're giving them room to roam and figure out their own narrative, they may not even be listening to you after a while, right? And maybe RJ would say, counterintuitively, right, more slides with less per slide. Like if he has a quote from someone, he'll break it slowly into 8 slides that slowly evolve, or an animated sort of slide. It is a great example I use with my students. iBiology is a public platform. You can look at all relatively well-considered talks there. Here's Harvard's Jeannie Lee. I love this slide. It communicates without even hearing the speaker, but certainly not going to distract from Jeannie. You see these differences in female-male chromosome right away, not a lot of text. But you can find a lot that are more familiar, right? We've all seen slides like this. And I would claim you're going to get in the way of some good, effective communication here. That may belong in a paper or maybe a poster session or something like that, right? All right, as a closing thought, I'd love to open it up to some Q&A. I like this final thought from Francine Prose, a great writer, great writing instructor as well. She really emphasizes communication and the role of compassion. And this is all about centering the audience again, but getting in their shoes. It's not so much always like what you want them to communicate, but what are they curious about? What do they want to know? And where does that overlap with your story? And how can you grab them by the hand and take them across this difficult technical stream to the other side? And I think we often just point and just go across these rocks, and I kind of go across this part of the stream and you'll love the other side. And we want to take them by the hand, like, okay, we're going to go with this rock because it's not wobbly and this one doesn't have moss, and we're going to take them over there with us to the other side of the science communication. All right? I just want to thank everyone for coming. I hope you had something provocative or actionable out of this. Feel free to get in touch. I'm Brandon R. Brown on LinkedIn. Reach out. I'll try to find some of you. as well. And happy communications, all of you.
That was really interesting, and I kind of wished I'd seen this 30 years ago before I started my writing career, because we don't usually get feedback on this kind of thing. I guess a couple of questions. How often do you ask for feedback from a colleague on your writing, and to what extent do you think we should? And then secondly, do you have any anecdotes on papers that didn't get cited as fast as they should because they were so badly written, even though the community later figured out how great they were? I mean, for example, Einstein's relativity papers are kind of a bit obscure to read, and eventually people thought how great they were. But any thoughts on that?
Sure. Did everyone hear the question? Yeah, we have the microphone going. So in my own case, I always get a couple of readers, and I've just written a chapter. It's a book that will come out through MIT Press. It's great. It's kind of celebrating 100 years of, and now much more, of general relativity and all the different experiments that have validated it. And I got to write a chapter on Pound-Rebka. And this person I was saying, I know, who studies black hole thermodynamics, really had them go through it and talk about it with me. Actually, for sharing our science, I found someone who writes in the tech sector, but has actually worked at the Exploratorium doing public outreach for a long time in San Francisco. It's a science museum, the Exploratorium. And he's actually a poet by training, and I really valued that input. And then I usually have my wife reads a lot, and it's a great scrutinizer of language. So I usually will just have 2 or 3 readers, and then at work on a paper or something like that, I think the danger is just doing it on ourselves, and then I see a lot of like, wow, I shared it with 10 people, and then you get so much feedback that it's very hard to process, and that's inefficient. And then if people have invested time, and they'll see an eventual version, like, well, mine's not the feedback you took in. So it's really great, I think, to form 1 or 2 key collaborative editing relationships when you can on an important piece of writing or a talk. Now, a paper that mainly maybe did not get the recognition it should. Very interesting about some of Einstein's early papers. That wasn't where I was going to go with an example. But if you don't mind, I'll just use, without pointing at any paper that was badly written, I'll just say, of my biology-related papers, probably one of the last ones I published, which I think is overall maybe the least what I would call significant for actionable neuroscience, has been the most cited because by then I learned how to write for and understand my audience much better. So just anecdotally, that's like, wow, that could be like a factor of 10 difference in what I might consider the more important work. Yeah, I think it really does happen. I think because I do enjoy crafting sentences and writing, I think I've often had the benefit of the doubt that I may not deserve as much as someone more brilliant scientist with better ideas who's just not communicating it as clearly. Yeah. Thanks. Other questions, stories?
Hello, Dr. Brown. Thank you for an amazing talk. Should I stand up?
Sure.
Okay. I have a question. With a follow-up question. What is your opinion on connecting science with like the scientists, or connecting science with the mind, body, and spirit?
Connecting science with the scientist and the mind-body experience? Yeah, I'm not sure this will directly answer that good question, but I do have a lot in the book about the power of anecdote and the power of sensory detail that we often overlook in communicating our work. It's really surprising how, and good fiction writers really know this, that sensory details and descriptions or little anecdotes, little bits of stories really connect people directly. And sensory information is fantastic. So we can often, especially if communicating to the general public, sprinkle in some details. Okay, maybe not what this lab smells like, although some experiments have interesting results. But sounds, tactile, vibrations. Just an example from the Apollo book. They did these crazy rocket tests in Huntsville, Alabama, that would break windows for miles and miles around in the whole town of Huntsville on the what became the Marshall Space Flight Center early in the space program. And you could say there were so many, this was this high decibels, and you could stop the description there. Or I could go through the archives and interviewing people and had there was an engineer at the first test who felt his internal organs vibrating so much that he was just like falling over and retching just from the power of the sound waves moving his rib cage around and stuff like that, or what it exactly like knocked a porch off a nearby house and things like that. So you'll see in journalism the so-called anecdotal lead, and once you start to see it, it's annoying. You'll have a phenomenon that's affecting hundreds of thousands of people, right? But the reporters always start, well, let's see how this affected so-and-so at this address. And it's kind of person in the street, but the human brain really does like a story of one other primate. So I think, I'm not sure I'm getting to it, but I love thinking of sensory details for connecting people to our work.
Yeah,
Does
that kind
make
of,
sense?
yeah, of course. That kind of goes to the follow-up question with how do you navigate, with that in mind, how do you navigate when to use a passive voice in your writing opposed to an active voice in your scientific writing explicitly?
Yeah, when do you use passive voice versus active voice in scientific writing?
Yes.
I interviewed a great linguist. She's at the University of California, Davis, Fernanda Ferreira. And she's dismayed that so many people are looking down on passive voice. And she used an example that I think is super useful for us as scientists. Passive voice. Stonehenge was built over many centuries. Right? That's passive. We literally don't know who built Stonehenge, and it was many different groups of people. It's like if you make that an active sentence, many groups of mysterious humanoids, built Stonehenge. But the point isn't those groups. So are you getting the point up front? So if the analysis is the point, then that belongs as a subject. The analysis was conducted with this software, and we found this anomaly. That's great. That's a passive sentence. And it makes sense because the doer of the analysis is sort of irrelevant to what we want to communicate in it. So are we getting the sensible subject for the sentence? I want to mention, too, and this came up, great conversations over lunch, that I don't want anyone to come away thinking, I just need to write really short sentences with a subject and a verb. And a lot of studies show that a healthy piece of writing is like an ecosystem with all different lengths of sentences, different structures. We don't want to if you wrote just active voice, like 5-word sentences, it would seem ridiculous and be actually kind of difficult to read eventually. So variety is good too. Does that help with a passive? Yeah. I don't avoid passive voice, but boy, when I did a lot of fundraising, and you won't find a lot of passive voice in there. Yeah.
Hey, good talk.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of distrust right now in science. How do you think we should go about addressing it and making sure the public is able to correctly trust good science?
Yeah, great question. And I do have some material on this in the book. One thing I did, I went to the medical literature to study how some of the best medical programs are training doctors to deliver unwelcome news to skeptical audiences, for example. And They found that happens better, for example, when you first learn what a patient or the patient's family knows about a problem. So it starts with a lot of listening, which is hard. Is Linda from the Bradbury Museum still here? Probably had to go. Linda was talking about how much listening they've done in terms of before building displays and exhibits. So that's part of it. I'm really fond. This is kind of a verboten name for some scientists, but I love a philosopher of scientists named Bruno Latour, who's actually a fan of science. He's seen as a critic, but he says what scientists can do more than anything to gain trust is actually kind of throw open the doors and show the process. It's not always the data and the graph, but hey, we had 3 committees that met over these 7 years and had this kind of feedback. And if primates see other primates in the primate process, I think he's really correct that can build trust. And I know a lot of what you all do, you can't exactly throw open the doors, but you can share the process, the kind of people who came together to collaborate. That's not classified. But it is a big problem, and it's scary to see it become so political. There's a data set from the Pew Research Center that in the 1970s, there was no political preference at all for how much do you trust scientists. And now, I don't need to name names, we have one group that's way down, and they're like 40% have a good opinion of science, and then another political group, like 85%, which is maybe too high a percentage, I know we would love to have 100%, but maybe that's not healthy. It used to all be flat at 70%. So it is really scary, but thinking about those Dunbar circles, I think, showing that or you care where your audience is coming from. But I do a pretty deep dive on the standard model of communicating science to the general public. Right? That we kind of try to dumb down some nugget and it rolls downhill out a chute and kind of lands with a thud on the blank slate. And if people accept it, then they're more ready to fund science. And there's a lot of literature poking a lot of holes in that model. A lot of our audiences do know a lot of science and a lot of things we don't know. So I hope that begins to address a really hard and very important problem, because some of it almost seems like we're headed into an era of some off-grid magical thinking. It'll be very difficult to recapture some folks, right? Yeah.
So if I can give that was a very good answer. If I can give what should hopefully be a quicker follow-up, not going too much into detail on it. On the other side of the coin, we also have potential sources of distrust that we would need to avoid. For instance, there are people out there who are either motivated thinkers or just dishonest and use tactics like quote mining. Is there something we can do to anticipate that and reduce the harm?
Wow. You said this wasn't going to be a complicated follow-up. It wouldn't require much detail.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. The little reverberations that are going to sneak into and permeate these other nearly impenetrable circles. This is just me speaking now, not based on any literature or advice I read at all. It seems like some of that is unstoppable. It's really worth fighting it for people who are open to more sources of information and correcting it. But I can't imagine crafting important communications such that they could never be misquoted. I mean, because now, let's be honest, it's not even misattributing or taking things out of context. Boy, that would be vanilla and nice, right? It's just making up scientific statements whole cloth and pitching them into an echo chamber, and then the next day retracting it kind of officially, like, oh yeah, we got that wrong, but boy, it's off and running, and many people believe that for the next 10 years and tell their friends and neighbors within their Dunbar circle about it. So the difficult work in terms of policy and politics is, it seems like studies show that it's the hard work of breaking into those circles, listening, respecting, like, okay, we have different points of view on this. I see where you're coming with the astrology, let's say, but here's, where I'm coming from and where we can usefully, it's time consuming. And there have been examples of deprogramming some pretty radical, dangerous, and I would say anti-science people, but it's taken a lot of time, right? And I don't pretend that's a satisfactory answer to a really difficult question. No, don't be sorry.
Brendan, thank you so much for your time, first of all. And then to tag on to what was just mentioned, there is clearly a difference between communication between scientists to scientists and then also to scientists to public. And do you feel like that when a lot of, let's say, the flowery words are being taken out in a scientific paper, that opens the door for people then to reverse that process and then take quotes out of scientific papers and turn them into, let's say, conspiracy theory statements and whatnot, and then make it easy. Does the language lends itself essentially to make that a negative statement?
This is absolutely just my opinion, and I'm going to say no to kind of drill down on something I mentioned to the earlier question. I kind of feel like I could feed my lab manual into the wrong corner of the internet and generate 10 conspiracy theories, right? So I don't think the exact wording of our text is going to avoid that too much. I do think the biggest problem, and I'm glad you asked the question, because to me the biggest problem is uncertainties and being honest about science as this process and our engineering work as a process, and it's iterative, and we may not believe next year exactly what we believed 10 years ago or last month, and that seems like to me at the center of the room for so many important things, whether it's climate, epidemiology. We all have projects in both of these important areas, for example. And that process of science and the error bars and trying to get a clear message across is the bigger obstacle than trying to ward off conspiracy theories in my mind. Great question.
Yeah, and just a little follow-up. You mentioned, the fear is a big driver of a lot of things that lead to misinformation by mining the fear of people. You brought up Max Planck in that sense. Goering was asked in the Nuremberg trials, why did so many Germans follow in line with you guys? And they just said, out of fear for not to belong. Mm-hmm. And so they mined that fear, and people marched along with them. So to a certain extent, we see this again. But it has a negative effect on the science community in that sense, because then people can throw out some stuff and people will believe without digging deeper into the background of what happened.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering if you use AI resources like Elicit or ChatGPT in your own work, and if you have any advice for how they might be helpful for writing abstracts or papers or presentations.
Sure. Great question. I do not. I just love writing myself. So I like to joke and not to discourage any reading, but did I just write the last typewriter maintenance manual, right? By equivalency. I will say, and I welcome my students, I'll say a couple things about ChatGPT. I'm definitely someone who welcomes my students using it. And I have statistical thermal physics I'm teaching right now, and they have to do a project, some kind of written project about a deep dive on some topic. And they are welcome to use it, but they really need to tell me how they're using it. They got to show me their questioning of the interface, what comes out, and what they did to it. I think my caution with chatbots for scientific writing, for a lot of the reasons I'm talking about. The resources that these engines can pull from to create a good scientific sentence are going to create a lot of not very fun to read sentences and paragraphs. So they will be worth some editing. But no, I think it might be a great way to start rough drafts. You have to look for the, I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting, I would know the word, the sort of mirages or artifacts, the phantasms that almost all of them still insert. These aren't real references, so it takes some work, but I'm all for embracing this new era. I do think, and maybe some people can build some better rules eventually, writing rules, into thinking about good verbs, et cetera. So the future might be quite bright. But for now, beyond rough drafts, I think these engines rely on a lot of existing, not very compelling scientific writing is the thing, yeah. All right, maybe we should let everyone go on to, I know you're busy, but I'm happy to hang out and chat if anyone has further questions. All right, thanks, everybody. Thank you.